Hello, everybody. Welcome to Language Acquisition 3 session, the role of morphosyntax. We have 3 great talks ready for you to join. And our first presentation will be by Daniel Ozorny on L1, L2 versus L3 transfer, grammatical gender and determiner acquisition in sequential quadrilinguals. So, Daniel.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my presentation real quick and that will start us off. I hope you can see my screen, everybody. All right, so, well, formally good evening now. Well, good day for those in the US. My name is Daniel, as has been stated, and I'm going to present on fourth language acquisition. Before I start, I just wanted to get one formality out of the way and know that the research is my own and not sponsored or endorsed by Northwestern, which I'm actually joining in September. Now, without further ado, let's get into the study. So one of the main questions which the L2 and further acquisition fields aim to answer is what is the role of previous languages when acquiring a new one? To lay out the background, I will consider the main tendencies in L3 acquisition field, but before I go there, I want to draw your attention to the term which will pervade all the further discussion, the transfer. The so-called transfer refers to assuming a property from a previous language. To illustrate, a student of English whose first language is Chinese and second is French might assume the article system or the mean to express definiteness or determinacy from French while acquiring English. The boundaries of transfer, i.e., what constitutes a property, are far from clearly defined, but they do offer us a very useful unit of mental grammar, which is transferable from one language to another. Now, the big question I mentioned can be split down further. For example, if we analyze it as take apart the first question with respect to transfer, we might get the two which I want to draw your attention to as well. Firstly, what transfers? And secondly, how does it transfer? Let me consider now the first question in a greater detail. The conceivable options are 5 for quadrilinguals. It is conceivable that L1 is always the main influence, or L2, or L3, or one of the 3, but not all of them, which is shown on the slide with the exclusive disjunction sign. And lastly, that it is, after all the previous languages which influence the subsequent language acquisition. There exist respective models, L1 privileged and L2 status. However, given lack or even absence of relevant research for L4, no theory of L3 being the privileged language emerged. Now, L1P poses that nothing can override the native language, and it is its nativity that gives the L1 the bridle and the reins. This theory extends easily to L4 in this study, claiming that L1 is the main influence for L4. The next up, L2S, poses that while L1 is acquired to the vast degree unconsciously, L2, which is acquired at the later stage, involves an overall higher cognitive level. And L2 argues that this kind of mental acuity during the conscious acquisition process gives L2 a particular factor in L3 acquisition. In this study, extending L2S to L4 might cause some problems, which I will elucidate in the prediction section. Also, I will have come back to the other models, having introduced the notions of wholesale versus partial transfer. Now, I want to emphasize the lack of models involving L3. While the previous studies considered which language would be privileged in L3 acquisition, L1 or L2, this study expands on that. Thus, the novelty of the study is in looking at all 3 previous languages as a potential source of transfer for L4. why should that be the case? Well, quadrilinguals effectively do present a much richer soil to reap from for the multiple cross-linguistic influences and to attempt to understand their impact. If we want to see a privileged influence, we want to look for it amongst many other influences. In this way, L3 acquisition can also serve to resolve some disputes in L3 acquisition. To paraphrase more academic, if there is a language, the grammar of which has a privileged role in the subsequent language acquisition, that language is most easily discernible amidst naturally plenty of other influences, L1, 2, and 3 for L4. And the same principle would apply if somebody would be able to find a homogeneous group of octa, penta, deca, etc. linguals. In this study, I will consider and contrast all the languages involved to make a determination whether there is evidence for a privileged language or whether language learning is, after all, cumulative. Now, speaking about cumulative, let's come back to the second question from the second slide. There is another way to think of transfer, not only asking which language it comes from, but also how it is that it does so. For theories like TPM, which you saw on the slide, there are theories that transfer is always wholesale, like for privileged languages. It's always wholesale, since it is a whole grammar of one language which transfers, not parts and bits of it. The other way to think about it is in terms of partial transfer, where all languages can be considered as sources of various properties. Advocating for the wholesale transfer among many models which look at a variety of ways. There are TPM and IHT which look to typology. There is language of community which looks at the social status of language, and there are many more. Advocating for partial transfer, we have models which in their nature all advocate for language learning being cumulative. Examples include CEM, cumulative enhancement, scalpel, LPM, linguistic proximity, etc. Now to the properties considered in this study. Russian and Ukrainian as fusional languages mark gender using affixes. It is important to note that unlike in agglutinative or some analytical languages, gender marking is marked together with case, tense, aspect, and other grammatical categories in the same morpheme. So the cues are not morphophonologically distinct. It is one morpheme which has marking for all that. L1 Russian has 3 genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. L2 Ukrainian has 4 genders, same plus common gender. The nouns of common gender can denote either or both masculine and feminine entities. That's very interesting morphological insight. English language does not have a grammatical gender system. And lastly, French has only 2, masculine and feminine. Feminine can be marked by letter E at the end of nouns and masculine by absence thereof. So much then for grammatical gender. Definiteness. The word determiner in the title of the presentation was actually confined to definiteness, as it is denoted by the definite article, the semantic iota function. The overt article system, while present in English and French, is absent from Ukrainian and Russian. However, I want to stress that it would be a mistake to assume that English article system would transfer to French merely because Slavic languages do not have an overt marking of definiteness. Such an approach reeks of contrastive analysis, which misses out on all of the crucial underlying computational processes. Nonetheless, having analyzed the definiteness as it is expressed in Slavic languages, the conclusion was reached that it is indeed unlikely for Russian or Ukrainian to influence the acquisition process significantly. And thus, I tested only English to French transfer. However, it is immensely important to stress that the grounds for this decision were not based on mere superficial absence of an overt article system. Lastly, the recent studies on gender acquisition were completed by Brown, who, affirming the cumulative nature of language learning, also attributed some of the influence to L2S model, the one which varies the second language. let me concisely state the predictions for this particular study now. The predictions for the models are as follows. For L1P, the influence of L1 should be crucial and override that of any other language. For L2S, which is troublesome to extend to L4, I assumed we shall see the evidence of L2 at least, and L2 shall trump influence of L1 for the very definition of that model. But it is hard to ascertain what the role of L3 will be. L2 might override L3, or the correlation is not really clear. Prediction of TPM is that the language which is the most typologically close to French would transfer, and for this study it would be English. This way, the models are lining up very nicely to advocate for L1, L2, L3 being privileged respectively. Lastly, the CEM and other partial transfer models expect the influence of all languages without a definite pattern or privilege possible to predict. So much for the background now, and let's turn to the study itself. The participants were 22 Ukrainian high schoolers, all of them juniors, with their languages being L1 Russian, L2 Ukrainian, L3 English, and L4 French. They were divided into 3 groups by their mastery of French. Firstly, 7 learners with A0 CEFR level of French. CEFR is common European framework of references, the leveling which is common through Europe. Secondly, 7 learners with A1 CEFR level of French. And thirdly, 8 students with A2 CEFR level of French. All of the participants self-reported levels. The teachers also rated them, and all the students were tested in French and in English. For task 1, the 25 stimuli all consisted of 6 syllables and were DPs with either definite or indefinite article. In the example on the screen, the correct form would have been la soleil très brillant and not le soleil, not la soleil, since the noun soleil is masculine in French. Conversely, they were DPs with the nouns, for example, which are masculine in French and Russian, but feminine in Ukrainian. And so that is supposed to give us insight into L2 transfer. At this point, I shall note that I looked for gender concord, not only for gender agreement. There was no testing for correct, incorrect agreement per se, though the mismatch was present in the ungrammatical stimuli. The 25 stimuli for the second task all consisted of complete sentences, each 10 syllables. Each of the stimuli contained a DP headed by a definite article there, like in the given example, je voulais jouer sans les mots du passé. The correct version would have not included the article le before mot du passé. It should be there in English, but it shouldn't be there in French. The scoring. Oh, right. I would like to make it very clear that the participants were tested in L4 French, right? The scoring typical for grammaticality judgment task was scores of 0 to 1. In cases where the transfer was detected, the participant got the score of 1 and 0 otherwise. The scores were calculated for each of the following categories of cross-linguistic influence. L1, that is transfer from L1, L2, L1 and 2, and L3. More about this now in a greater detail. L1, exclusive transfer from L1. For example, noun way is masculine in L2, feminine in masculine in L1, sorry, feminine in L2, and feminine in L4. The transfer was detected if the learner judges a stimuli in French language where noun pain was marked as masculine to be grammatical. I also would like to note that per the established guidelines, yes judgments are the ones which are considered to be more informative than no judgments. So this was the road I took. In a similar manner, if a learner found to be grammatical a noun which should have been masculine in French, but was expressed as feminine, it is reasonable to speak of L2 transfer like in this dog situation. It is not confined to the genders. We had a variety of stimuli. if the gender coincided in L1 and 2, and the learner found it grammatical in a French DP where it was actually not grammatical, it was scored as L1 and 2 transfer. Lastly, when the learner attempted to insert an article when it should be in English but should not be in French, L3 transfer was detected. Now to the results. Having calculated the scores for all categories, I also calculated the average detected transfer rate, ADRT. It stands for the average cumulative score for a given category divided by the number of questions. In other words, it is a measure of how much transfer was detected on every level for every given group of learners given out of 1. The results do show that there is indeed solid evidence for transfer from all previous languages. Let's zoom in now. We see on the graph that the learners started out on A0 level with almost everything transferring. The numbers are very close to 1, as in 100% of transfer. As the level increased with their mastery of French, the rate plummeted to roughly 0.1 for L3 transfer, the lowest, right? That might be connected to their mastery of English. 0.18 for L2 transfer, 0.25 for L1 transfer, and 0.3 for L1 and 2 transfer. It is logical that L1 and 2 is the most resistant to erosion transfer because of the coinciding values for gender in L1 and 2. Having saw evidence for the transfer, the next step was to ascertain whether it was indeed level that accounted for the plummeting rates of transfer. So for an ANOVAs were ran with level as independent variable, and they all show significant correlation between level and transfer scores for every category of cross-linguistic influence. However, much more insightful evidence can be shown by MANOVA, which looks into the intercorrelation between the dependent variables and finds how much of the variation in the dependent variables can be accounted for by the dependent variable. In this study, different multivariate tests gave different partial eta squared results. Partial eta squared is precisely the measure which speaks to how much of the variation in transfer is accounted for by the level. The results ranged from 62.5 to 95.4. 62.5 was given by Pillai's trace. And more sensitive Wilks lambda and Roy's largest root showed 82% and 95.4%. They all say that there is a significant proportion, so a lot of the variation is accounted for by the level, but the data can be assumed as significant. Sorry about that. But it will be resolved by the further tests. So MANOVA, together with multivariate tests, gave eigenvalues and roots for the canonical variable, which in and of itself accounted for variation in the rate of transfer. Only one of 2 roots was found significant and said to account for 98% of variation. The other root was not found significant. Thus, it is safe to assume that it is indeed level, which counts for plummeting transfer rate as it should be. Another test was run, as you see, and that was standardized discriminant function coefficients. However, let's sum up and back down to the predictions. So, was a privileged role of L1 detected as predicted by L1P? No, it was not. Was a privileged role of L2 detected as predicted by L2S? No, it was not. Was a privileged role of L3 detected as predicted by TPM? Same again, it was not. Was the cumulative language learning detected as predicted by CEM et al? Yes, it was indeed. To offer conclusive remarks, the study found evidence of all previous languages and of no privileged language amongst the previous languages, thus supporting the partial transfer models. Thus, the insights which L4 acquisition gives can be of great use to L3 acquisition to distinguish and tease apart between different models and help to solve the debate. But these findings are also very valuable standalone findings. Looking into further research, I think this study strongly suggests that there is a need to establish not whether all previous languages influence the subsequent language learning, but rather how it is that they do so. To do so, my follow-up work, which is at the stage of data analysis now, looks at the pure semantic property of the scope of disjunction and negation in L4 German and French. At this point, I would like to acknowledge two people who helped me immensely over the course of this first in this field paper. Megan M. Brown, a PhD student at Boston University, gave me extensive feedback all the way through the preparing this book, and Professor Susan Flynn offered me incredibly insightful feedback on my writing and thinking, which always had me keeping the larger picture of acquisition goals in mind. I am indebted very profoundly to both of them. Please do reach out if you have any questions about the research on my current work. The slides will be available on the website, which you see on the screen soon after the presentation. And now I would gladly answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel, for interesting talk. So we'll now open up the question session. You can either, you will preferably raise your hand virtually. There's a virtual hand on the bottom of the Zoom, and we'll be able to see you. Or if you prefer, you can also type on chat to ask questions.
Somebody said that, oh, it was a way ago, that the slides, yeah, they will be on the website. So please, I can type the website in the chat as well.
Yeah, that would be great.
Here you go. I hope somebody would have some questions. I could have talked about L4 transfer for 10 more minutes.
Well, I can start the question. I was wondering about the L2 versus L3 levels. How do you decide which one is L2 and L3, and the proficiency of the L2 and L3? You know, would that would probably matter, and how to decide, you know, are
Definitely.
they proficient in L2, right? And on the model, does it talk about the year of acquisition? So how many years do you need to acquire this language for it to be your L2 or L3? So if you can explain that a little bit more, that would be great.
And I think there is a question in the chat which lines up very nicely about sequence of language learning, age, stage on the onset. Yeah, so the participants, they actually, so they had formal instruction in French and English, and instruction of English became instruction of English started way before instruction of French. So it is both level and mastery of English and time of exposure primary to English. So you can assume, you can say that level of English is actually sort of one rank higher on CEFR than French. So for those A2, it would be B1 in English, because they had about they had significantly more exposure to English. And that is how I distinguish both onset and level. And there was no case, as far as I can remember, that somebody would be less proficient in English than in French, or would have less level of proficiency in English than in French. That would have, been very questionable to see the results, L3, L4 transfer. Yes. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So one of the questions from the attendees was whether you consider the age and the stage of one's life for the onset of language acquisition. So when they started acquiring the language as the onset.
Yeah, so for this, they all were of the same age, and they all, because they had a formal instruction, they all started learning English and French at the same time, like literally. They came to school and they started. So it was a very homogeneous group, which I think contributes to the validity and veridicality of the results I got. But yes, I did.
Yeah. So what age was it? What if you specify?
High school junior, so they were 17 to 18 years, and
So
their exposure, yes,
yes, sorry.
17 to 18. Those all of them were in those, and they started exposure when they were, well, about 11 years ago. They started very slow exposure to English. It did not help them to achieve high proficiency. In the same way, they started exposure to French about 5 years ago before the test. But I want to say that it was, the level, say it was almost initial state level of proficiency. Those 5 years are formal instructions, 2 hours, academic hours a week, not all like 30 weeks a year. So the amount of French they were exposed to is actually very sparse. So the 5 years doesn't speak much. The level of proficiency are much more informative in that way, I think.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Alex is whether this seems very tricky work. Is there any way to compare these results to those of participants with various subsets of these languages? So whether these results are clearly accounted for by linguistic transfer rather than random performances. So any other psychological tests?
So about different various subsets of these languages, I think that is about sort of bidirectional work, and whether I would have, for example, acquisition of French then English. It gets tricky with quadrilinguals because it's not easy to find a group of quadrilinguals, particularly with different subsets of languages. I would definitely look over. So the follow-up work, I ran some statistic tests to find that it's not random, to try to ascertain that it's not random. I'm not reporting on that now, but I tried as much as I could to exclude that, right? In the instruction they received, there were some sort of stimuli. We said, please don't put the random stuff. So I did what I could. It would be very interesting to look at the sort of different languages of different subsets of these languages. I'm reaching out to my colleagues in Kazakhstan and other sort of post-Soviet countries, which also study lots of languages. They have Russian, Kazakh, then English and French or German, things like that. I'm also running a study with German instead of French right now. And so trying to ascertain that. So the lack of linguistic variation and testing these assumptions, the results against a wider array of languages is definitely something which we should look into.
Yes, Alex clarified a little bit. Yeah.
Oh, right. Comparing quadrilinguals to trilinguals. Yeah, so the results, and again, this speaks to the theories of third language acquisition. They are consistent with some models, not consistent with other models. There has not been much research on these subsets of languages for trilinguals, unfortunately. For bilinguals, it's sort of hard to tease apart Russian, Ukrainian, and none that I'm aware of. But given the current debate, these findings are supported by some in L3 acquisition, yes, CEM, but not supported by some other ones. So it's again, it's sort of fishy to use an informal word. Did I answer the question after a bit better after the clarification? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have about a minute. So if you have a very quick question to ask, this is your time to do it. If not,
probably
thank you,
not.
Daniel.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you,
it was
Daniel.
A pleasure. Okay.
Yeah, and he has his website shared on chat. So please, his slides will be up there after the presentation.